Hello and welcome to this lecture. Today we're going to be talking about two different populations. One is Hispanic individuals and the other is elderly. Let's go ahead and get started. I found this video really interesting. It is 4 years old now, so it might be a little dated, but I think it's fascinating because it brings up kind of this conflict in terms of veterans being deported. You think of a veteran, a military individual who's served, and you think of, someone who's honorable, someone who's sacrificed, and yet, this covers that these individuals are still somehow being deported, which brings up an issue in terms of laws, that if laws are created to, generally laws are generalizable, like this population shall do this or this law shall be applicable to that, but there might be individuals who, in as this case shows, where there might be either an exception to a policy that's needed, or a way to say, all right, well, in general, people will be, this population will, this will happen or that will happen or this will be the law, with some exceptions. That way, there's individuals who, just because of whatever their specific situation is, maybe the law isn't as applicable to them, or maybe they might have a special situation. So how do we handle or work through those situations, or those events when they occur, and treat individuals with the respect that's due them based on what they've done for our country, as opposed to treating them as like, oh, well, doesn't matter, sorry, you're illegal, it doesn't matter what you've done for our country, we're going to kick you out. And I think this topic in general, just because of the news, and I don't want to become political right now, but I think that there's a lot that we could talk about in terms of the mental health side of things, because nearly half of all Hispanic adults express concern that they or a family member or a friend might be deported. So think about what that might feel like if you're going through your entire day, your entire week, your basically your existence here in the US with stress or depression or concerns about, will a family member or friend be caught today? I need to make sure that I'm driving the speed limit, because if I get pulled over, that I could get caught and I could, be taken back or sent back to my country. And so, from a mental health perspective or approach, there are some very real factors that are at play here. And again, I think that this is a really important topic right now. So it's going to be part of the discussion post a little bit later on. You'll see, in terms of what are your thoughts about this specific issue. And then, of course, for this YouTube video, I'll put the link in the description. So I put everything for this population and the next population. I just stuck a whole bunch of information in one slide, so we'll go through it as opposed to me creating multiple slides for each bullet point here. 1 out of 5 Hispanic individuals is living in poverty as of 2017. Again, that's dated information at this point. But 16% did not have health insurance. And again, that goes back to the concern that we just mentioned. I think a lot of individuals stress or worry about, if I have insurance, will that be some way for individuals to come find us? If I put undocumented individuals on my health insurance, could that result in, people somehow coming in, breaking down our door and deporting family members or friends? According to a Pew Research poll, 52% of Hispanics reported experiencing racial or ethnic discrimination. And we discussed this a little bit, or this might have come up in a previous discussion post about microaggressions, and how many of you have said that you've experienced some type of microaggression. So that is definitely still present with this population as well, as some of the previous populations that we've seen or explored this semester. What else do I want to say about this population? Acculturation is a big factor and something to pay attention to and think about. And that, I'll talk about that a little bit maybe in the next slide, because there's a case example that I want to cover there. But those who have, there's kind of a balancing act for individuals. Those who have maybe completely rejected maybe the values or the culture that they come from, or maybe completely accepted, if they're coming here to America, our cultures or our values, or people who are kind of in the middle of like, well, I still value my country's, values or beliefs or whatever, but I'm also open to American values or culture. And so very much there's this aspect of how do people kind of balance that and kind of live with, a foot in each world, if you will, as opposed to completely being solidly one or the other. Because more so when you're solidly one or the other, that seems to be where people kind of struggle of like, well, I'm living in America, but I'm gonna, be very traditional and stay very rigorous to my home values and country beliefs and cultural values, etc. Like, well, that person's probably going to struggle here in the US because wherever they came from, things are very different here. And that can well, I'll just go ahead and talk about this. That can also cause a lot of conflict between, say, family members who came from a previous country, whatever their home country is, coming here, and then maybe they're raising kids or grandkids, and that can cause this conflict as kids or grandkids are raised here, and they're maybe a little bit more accepting or open to American values and beliefs. There's this conflict of like, well, why aren't you, why don't you still value these things that are, from our home country? And the person who's being raised here is like, well, but that's not how I'm being raised. That's not my background, or that's not, maybe necessarily my history because of me being, raised and growing up here. So that can cause some family tension, as you can imagine. Let's see, cultural values and characteristics. So Hispanic individuals tend to be very family focused. There tends to be this kind of hierarchical structure. So parents are in charge, children, sometimes kind of that approach of should be seen, not heard, be very respectful of your elders, that kind of thing. A very traditional approach, very traditional in terms of gender roles and expectations. So as you can imagine, women should be pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen, that type of thing. Men should be very machismo and be the breadwinner and that type of thing. And maybe, again, it's 2024, so maybe some of those things have changed a little bit. Spirituality is very important, and this can play several different roles. So individuals might be Catholic. They might believe in good or evil spirits or pray to saints. They also may use more kind of indigenous healing practices and herbal remedies. So the spirituality religious piece can show up kind of in many different ways, again, depending on what country the individual is raised in or what their, kind of family beliefs are, that type of thing. Very similar to populations that we've already seen, such as Black people, and Hispanic individuals lag behind white individuals in terms of education, completing a college or bachelor's degree. And unsurprisingly, this is similarly or also driven by some of the same factors, such as socioeconomic status, financial factors, possibly the need to work or bring in money as opposed to pursuing an education. Or, depending on, again, where that person was raised or what their family values are, there might be less of a value placed on education and more of a value being placed on, go work, go bring money into the house or send money back home to friends or family, etc. Cultural strengths. So one of the strengths of this population is having such a strong cultural identity. And you might see this if you see, like, say, Mexicans or Puerto Ricans. They're very proud of that. They're very proud of where they come from, who they are. You'll see like little Puerto Rican flags hanging in like from rear view mirrors or on a license plate or something like that. So that's definitely a cultural, there's that cultural identity, but that's also a strength for them. And then I've kind of already talked about the spiritual beliefs. That can also be a strength because it can provide that additional social support or belief that something greater out there is looking out for you. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of stigma around mental health. There tends to be, as we've seen in previous populations, a stigma around seeking mental health or around experiencing psychological distress. And how this shows up for Hispanic individuals, and it also shows up very much for Asian individuals as well, is that psychological distress will come out in physical symptoms such as somatic concerns like headaches or body aches or that type of thing. And so that's something to be aware of and to pay attention to if you're working with individuals who are of a Hispanic background. That they might say, oh, I have headaches, or oh, I have all this tension in my shoulders or my back, or I have this ache in my back, or that type of thing. And so it can be worth questioning and asking, like, well, how long has that been going on for? Is there something that caused that? To try and decipher, is there some physical issue or concern that's going on, or is it just the psychological factor that's being presented as that somatic concern? I've kind of already talked about how Hispanic individuals will often underutilize resources such as insurance or maybe other community resources for that fear of undocumented family members or friends being discovered and deported. Something to note here is that there are many between group and within group differences. So, as shown in the picture here, you've got, individuals from Central South America, who are all kind of grouped into this, like, oh, Hispanic, but there can be, um, within Mexico, maybe there can be differences in terms of like cultural factors within the group. So where that person was raised, were they raised maybe more rural, or if you're raised maybe in Cancun versus Mexico City, there are cultural factors, just because Cancun has a lot of Americans and other individuals visiting for like spring break and that kind of thing. But there can also be, differences in terms of, say, Mexico versus other countries south of Mexico, like Belize, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, etc. Each of those countries has their own unique culture and identity. And so paying attention to that, sometimes Hispanic can all just be grouped into one, like, oh, this huge group of people. But it's important to really pay attention to that each of those countries has their own nuances, their own favorite food or culture. And so that's important to pay attention to and think about and ask, like, specifically for your client, whoever is sitting in front of you, what is their specific heritage, background, culture? Where did they come from? Where were they raised? And what are the cultural factors that are present for them specifically? Linguistic issues. So this can be focused on several different factors. I pushed forward onto the next slide, but linguistic factors could be either that there aren't very many counselors who can speak in Spanish or who understand Spanish enough to kind of, get through it. Because if there's more, say, again, I talked about those somatic concerns, if there's more terminology that's maybe medically specific, someone might not have, enough, like as a counselor, enough language to be able to get through a session. And so that could be one concern. The other concern is from a psychological testing perspective. More so now in 2024, tests have been, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like, not interpreted. I'm blanking on the word, but there's a Spanish version, which can be helpful, right? I don't know if I can't remember if we've talked about psychological tests a ton in this class, but historically tests are all based in English, right? If they're developed here in the US, they're based in English, which can cause issues if you're asking someone like, well, who is the president currently, or who was the president in 1950, or what is it mean to be an American, or what, if you look at this picture, like, what is this? Oh, well, that's a book. Oh, well, that's a chair. Thinking like intelligence testing and that kind of thing. If someone's, primary language is not English, they tend to do very poorly on these tests. And that can, of course, be a concern, because now maybe you're saying, oh, well, this person needs special education or additional tutoring or something, when they're actually very smart. They just maybe don't have the, maybe just English isn't their first language. And so, of course, they're going to struggle on some of those tests. So that's some of the things to be paying attention to in terms of the linguistic side of things, that last bullet from the last slide there. So we've kind of already talked about acculturation in the previous slide, which I said I wasn't going to do, and then I ended up doing. But on page 356, if you've got the previous version of the textbook, the older edition, is a really good example. It talks about Juan. He's 46. He's Latino, was born and raised in Mexico, and then eventually came to the U.S. And he's having a lot of fights with his wife because he believes his wife is essentially raising their 5 children to be too Americanized. And so again, there's a lot of conflict between his values. He values family and being machismo, and the environment that they're in. The case example here doesn't say, where in the U.S. they are. So maybe there's some specific, state cultural factors that are at play. But there's these different expectations, right, in terms of American values, and how those are at play, or how the environment might be at play. And so Juan is definitely struggling with this, which is causing some mental health issues. It's causing him to have fights with his wife. And so you're noticing, hopefully, you're seeing some of those acculturation pieces play out, as he's kind of very traditional, and might be focused very much on wanting to do things in a more traditional way, as opposed to his wife, who's maybe more open or accepting of American culture, and is that's how she's raising their children. And so I thought it was a really interesting case in terms of just kind of how some of those acculturation factors might be playing out or might be present. And in terms of acculturation factors, there's, of course, a plethora of things that could impact that, in terms of the person's background, their generational status. So, for example, an elderly individual might have a harder time acculturating to a new environment, or to a new set of beliefs and values, than, say, someone who's very young, who's maybe like 5 or 6 and is coming to the U.S. The reason for immigration might impact acculturation, and that person's ability to be flexible, or adapt to a new environment. How much that person prioritizes or adheres to traditional values of their home country versus being open to U.S. cultures and values. All of those things and much, much more can, of course, impact acculturation. So it's important to consider, for whoever your clients are, especially if you're working with populations who weren't maybe born or raised in the U.S., where are they at kind of on this like acculturation scale? And is that causing some type of additional distress or psychological disturbance for them, if they're, kind of struggling with that acculturation piece? So this research, I like to include this research because a lot of people in past discussion posts have never heard of this term Latinx. And so I want to include this research article, and it's relatively new, so 2020. The purpose of the study, so given that the term Latinx has gained popularity in several academic and activist spaces, the usage of the term, however, has not explored this myriad of kind of complexities of how it's been constructed and reproduced within higher education spaces, referring to Latin Americans. Reflected in the literature review of this article, there are various forms of understanding or misunderstanding of the term Latinx, and there's been no published at the time research on how Latinx or Latina or Latino students use, identify with, or understand the term. So essentially looking at how, what is people's understanding. So there was like a poster put out, and 90 individuals ended up reaching out to the researcher, and the researcher, had a conversation with them. And then if they were interested, if the participants were still interested in the study, they were then scheduled for a 60-minute interview. So 34 individuals total ended up saying, yes, I'm still interested in completing the study, and met the inclusion criteria. So inclusion criteria, participants had to be at least 18 years old, and had to be a graduate or an undergraduate student, and self-identify as Latino or Latina or Latinx. Of course, they completed several consent forms as part of this process, and everything went through the Institutional Review Board. So the IRB, if you're not familiar, they're the ones who approve research studies. Pseudonyms were used for this study to protect the identity of all participants. So I'll mention some participants' names here in a minute. That's like a made-up name. It's not their actual name. So the data that was collected, qualitative data was used. Demographic questions were asked about their class standing, their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, and country of origin. All data collected was used to analyze how participants relate to, identify with, and understand the term Latinx. So for example, here's some example questions from the research, and this is how you know that it's qualitative data, because qualitative data can be very hard to quantify. So for example, please describe when you first learned about the term Latinx. Well, that's not something that you can really ascribe a number to, like 1, 2, 3, 10, etc. What does Latinx mean to you? How do you explain the term Latinx to your family, community, and peers? Are there any spaces where you intentionally choose to use the term Latinx or not? So again, those are all questions that you can't really ascribe a number to, like 1 equals yes, 2 equals no. So qualitative data. The results, so learning about the term Latinx, 21 of the participants stated that they first saw the term Latinx via social media, and 13 of them learned about it in higher education settings, so either through like at class or from a peer. Defining and understanding the term. So Marco said that the term Latinx to him is an inclusive way of describing our community because he finds it very interesting when we think about Spanish language, when we, if you've got a group of 10 women and then if one guy walks up and joins, now the group becomes Latinos instead of Latinas. And so there's definitely this, this gender play that occurs within Spanish language. How do they transfer and explain the term Latinx to their family and friends? Many participants said that they'd never introduced or defined that term Latinx in their homes, as often parents or grandparents might not speak English or have not they don't have any type of formalized education or training. And so they, might not really understand or grasp why this differentiation between Latino and Hispanic, or why someone's deciding to use the term Latinx. Another student said, I consider myself Latinx or Latina. I prefer to use anything but Hispanic. And consciously, I don't use the word Latinx in political science classes because they don't understand what you're saying. They don't know what you're trying to talk about or why you're using that term. So future research should explore the diffusion of and intersectionality of the term Latinx to understand the significance of the various ways that gender, sexuality, language, race, ethnicity, disability, culture, immigration, geography, phenotype, etc. influences knowing in all realms of life and not just higher education. And then implications. So this kind of comes back to identity. We've kind of there's been this theme of identity at different points throughout the lectures. And so how are we identifying ourselves? How are others, whoever the others out there are, how are they identifying us? And if you're Hispanic, how do you identify yourself and how does the world define or portray you? So those are just some things to think about in terms of implications, why this would be important to us as counselors in terms of whoever our clients are, how are they identifying themselves or how do they describe themselves? Most commonly, the term Latinx was used in academic and activist spaces to pluralize Latin American communities into a gender inclusive or pan-ethnic group. However, in the process, without an in-depth examination of its usage and its implication, the term has rather neutralized gender versus achieving its original goals of inclusivity. Due to the fast visibility and growing usage of the term Latinx, this term may be considered more of a fad, and has maybe even created some discomfort among Latin American people. So this is also one of the discussion questions. It'll be interesting to see what you guys respond to in terms of that. Now we are switching gears and talking about the counseling older individuals. So with an aging population, the U.S. is ill-equipped and unprepared for these individuals. If you look at statistics, there's a large amount of individuals, I don't know the exact number, who are getting to a point where they're going to need some type of assisted living, or they're going to need some type of additional support in terms of activities of daily living, because they're not going to be able to do some of those things for themselves. And there is a lack of beds. I think there's a lack of 4,000 beds or something like that, as the years continue to pass and these individuals continue to age. So that's going to be probably a very imminent concern coming up in the next couple of years. Women do tend to live longer, so there's 39 men for every 100 women, which can probably make the dating pool, once you get to a certain age, kind of difficult. If you're in your late 70s or 80s, there's less men to choose from. This defines old as, there's kind of this newer definition as 80 being old instead of 60 or 70, as we continue to live longer and longer than we used to. Ageism has been described as prejudice against one's future self, and I really like this quote or this idea. This is from the very beginning of the chapter. because I think it can be really easy, at least for me. I tend to be someone who's like always going and always on the move. And so it can be really easy to end up, behind a car that's moving what feels like way too slow in the left lane. And I finally get around them, and then I think like, come on, Grandpa, let's drive a little faster. Drive like you've got somewhere to be, or end up at a grocery store behind someone who's walking really, really slow and think to myself, like, come on, Grandma, move a little faster. Which is that, that ageism coming out, some of those kind of microaggressions against other individuals. So I have to, kind of catch my, I don't ever say that out loud or like to them. But I have to kind of catch myself and think, am I being ageist against my future self? Because I, at some point, and all of you at some point, will be old. And how do we want individuals who are younger than us to treat us once we get to that point in time? Hopefully with respect and dignity. There are physical impairments and limitations that begin to occur. Individuals, of course, might experience difficulty seeing or hearing, or as I mentioned earlier, be no longer to complete activities of daily living, such as remembering to take pills or being able to shower on their own or that type of thing. And so, depending on what that person's life or their career has looked like, many elderly may financially struggle. So think about a single parent, male, female, who's maybe a single parent. They're raising 2 to 3 kids on his or her own and probably don't have much, if any, money to put towards retirement because they're basically living paycheck to paycheck. Now fast forward, and that person is, maybe late 70s or early 80s, and do they have the retirement funds to be able to retire comfortably and live out their life, with that dignity and respect? Or are they maybe struggling, or are, kind of wondering, all right, well, what are my options now that I'm elderly and can't continue to work and also don't have finances available? Elderly adults do tend to be sexually active, so according to research, sexual activities remain important to both old men and women. And what they look for might vary. So men may look for younger, attractive women, while older women may look for may be more selective and might seek men with either status or some type of security. Although, if you've spent any time looking at news or had time to look up blogs or read any type of articles about Florida communities and how sexually active some of the elderly communities are, I don't know that there's a whole lot of, those types of maybe preferences or specific things that they're looking for. So I think, again, I think it kind of depends on, is that person looking for a one night stand, or are they looking for a relationship? Because, what you're looking for can be very different there. If you want a good laugh, there's several articles out there in terms of elderly communities and their sexual escapades. Elderly do have a lot of strengths, though, one of them being a lifetime of experience. So think about how much history and knowledge someone who's been living for 60, 70, 80 years has. And, if we just take a minute and slow down and sit and talk to them and ask, well, what was it like in your day? Or what was your experience like? Or, how have you handled this situation? Or how have you handled this difficult issue in your life? There's a lot that we can learn and gain from them. Elderly individuals experience experience ageism and microaggressions. Ageism is defined as negative attitudes toward the process of aging or toward elder individuals. And so you've probably heard comments. You heard how I tend to have or think about these comments or have these thoughts in terms of some of those thoughts that I expressed earlier. And so again, it's important for us to remind ourselves, or at least remind myself when I have those thoughts, to try and be more understanding and to try and approach that situation with more respect and concern, in terms of like, well, maybe this person is having a really hard time seeing, or, maybe they're having a hard time getting where they're going or something like that. Getting older can result in mental decline, such as memory issues, dementia, or Alzheimer's. And this can also result in being treated in demeaning ways, such as kind of this like elderly speak, kind of how you would talk to a baby, like, are we ready for our bath now? Have we taken our medications yet? And obviously, that could probably be pretty frustrating if you're an elderly person and you're being talked to like that, because you've lived this whole life, you've been independent, you've been an adult, you are still an adult, and yet, people are starting to treat you like you're a little kid. And so, how do we, again, kind of remember to treat our elders with respect and not demean them or treat them as if they're, infants who don't have a brain? Elder abuse and neglect does happen, and there's actually a really sad example of this from the textbook. This can include emotional, financial, physical, and sexual abuse, such as being taken advantage of or being neglected by a caregiver or a family member. And this is one of those aspects of our role as a counselor where it's important that if we do see or notice any type of elder abuse or neglect occurring, that we, of course, talk to whoever the victim is and try and get them help and report that to whoever the officials are if we see it or notice it happening. Substance abuse can be an issue with this population, and a lot of times is an issue with the population. So, for example, if you think about someone who's maybe, they were maybe a CEO or they worked really hard their whole lives, and they felt like they were contributing to something, they felt like they were giving back to their community, or they really liked what their job was, and then they retire. If there's no transitionary plan, that person might feel like, well, I'm not contributing to anything. I'm just sitting around bored at home. And then it can become pretty easy to start drinking all day or doing other drugs. So that can definitely cause an issue, which then starts to cause other problems in terms of maybe financial issues or mental health issues, etc. And then depression, social isolation, and suicide, and other mental health factors and issues are present in the elderly population. So, if you think about you might have gone through a lot of life changes. You've gone 50, 60 years working and being independent to now maybe you've got health issues or mental health concerns, and you can no longer be independent or take care of yourself or, get around or do the things that you used to do. That, of course, can cause depression, maybe social isolation. As you continue to age, a lot of the friends that you used to have are maybe passing away, and so you are not as connected to friends or family as maybe you used to be. And if you're not working or don't have a job, it's not like, for some people it can be really hard to make new friends or to get out there and be socially involved. If you're having to rely on friends or family to drive you around places, if you can't be as independent, there can definitely be this lack of purpose, this lack of community, this lack of connection. And so paying attention to how that might be at play with individuals that you're maybe working with. And of course, increased medical concerns can either impact that or vice versa, one way or the other. So medical concerns can impact depression, anxiety, etc., or depression, anxiety can impact medical concerns. So it's important to pay attention to get that kind of interplay there and spruce out, is this a medical issue, is this a mental health issue that's going on here? So one of the important things that would be our focus as a therapist or counselor is paying attention to, is there isolation going on? Is there a lack of, feeling connected to, the community, an organization, etc. And so helping, if our clients are open to that, helping them explore, how do you stay active? How do you stay involved? Is that volunteering? Is that finding a senior citizen center and being connected with other individuals your age? Is that, finding a new hobby? So helping them avoid some of that social isolation, which will then hopefully help prevent some of that depression and other factors that are kind of in that mental health side of things. So values clarification, here's another research article from 2013. I'll go ahead and read what's on the slide. So Joe was a 69-year-old divorced white male presenting to the clinic with problems of depression and anxiety. Over the past 10 years, Joe had difficulty coping with many stressful life events. So his wife divorced him. His mother, who he'd been providing care with, passed away. He developed skin cancer, which is currently in remission, and his business ended up going bankrupt. So he lost his house. He had to relocate to a studio apartment. He had to ask his son for money and ask his son to help support him. And Joe's symptoms currently include depression, anhedonia, problems falling asleep, extreme fatigue throughout the day, feelings of worthlessness, inability to concentrate, and additionally, Joe reported significant symptoms of generalized anxiety, such as excessive and hard time controlling his worrying, worrying about his health, his finances, his family, his future. So he's just kind of worrying about everything across the board. And the therapist had tried a problem solving conceptualization or approach with him and found that that wasn't really helpful. There were no significant improvements. So, what do we do with Joe? Well, the therapist decided to switch gears and try an ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy approach. And you can see here on the screen the main things that ACT ends up encompassing or incorporating. So, sessions 1 through 3 focused on value clarification. So, what are Joe's values? What's important to him? And really exploring that. And I liked that 1 through 3 sessions focused on that in terms of this breakdown, just because values can be one of those topics that can be really hard to explore in terms of it can take several sessions to kind of get through in terms of what are my values, what is actually really important to me, especially if it's something that that person hasn't really spent any time thinking about. Then sessions 4 and 5 were focused on kind of this creative hopelessness and acceptance and willingness. And so within ACT, there's several different things that you can do. So one of those is analogies or using analogies and metaphors. So for this, the therapist used the idea of a rope or a tug of war with a monster. So essentially helping Joe explore what are the things that he needs to accept or be open to or willing to accept versus kind of this creative, this kind of hopelessness or feeling like he maybe has no control over his life. And so the idea is essentially like, hey, if, does it make sense to, have a tug of war with a monster? If you walk up to a rope and it's you on one side and this monster on the other side, and you're tugging and you're not really getting anywhere and you feel like you're wasting all this energy, and the monster ends up, being, I don't know, whatever the current situation that you're in, are you going to continue to just fight with this monster until the end of time? And it kind of helps the client realize, like, oh, maybe I am wasting a lot of time and energy, and maybe there's a different coping strategy that I could be doing that's more helpful or more useful than just continuing to fight with this monster in a tug of war that is never going to go anywhere. So the idea being like, well, what happens if you just drop the rope and stop doing this tug of war with the monster? What happens? Like, well, I don't know. I guess I could drop the rope and see. Yeah, like, well, what happens if you just, let this go and accept whatever the situation is? And so that's kind of the analogy. There's several different, if you want to, a better explanation of it than the one that I just butchered, there's several different examples of it on YouTube. It's a pretty good analogy. Sessions 6 through 7, so this focused on diffusion, so increasing awareness of thoughts, of feelings, of physical sensations, and diffusing from them. So this could be an exercise that the therapist probably did with Joe, something along the lines of, instead of I am anxious or I am depressed, having Joe practice like, well, what if you have the thought, I'm noticing that I'm anxious, or I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I'm anxious, or I'm noticing that I'm experiencing these physical sensations, which I will label as anxiety. And so you notice through that progression that instead of I am anxious, it's I'm noticing that I'm having these thoughts, or I'm noticing that I'm having these physical sensations, which helps diffuse the client or helps them create that space between I am this thing versus I'm having this thought. And so it can help, again, in terms of that diffusion, and help the client realize, like, okay, well, I am not literally anxiety, or I am not literally anxious, but I'm just noticing these things. And then sessions 8 and 9 were mindfulness. I think you guys know what mindfulness is. Session 10 through 12 was committed action. So this is essentially increasing value consistent behaviors. Like, all right, Joe, we've talked about diffusion, we've talked about acceptance, we've talked about your values. Now, how do you start to take action towards those things? What are some things that you're going to start doing to moving towards helping you move towards this value-based life that you've talked about? So that could be for Joe, maybe exploring some ways to become more connected to his community, because he's probably pretty isolated based on all the things that he's had go on recently. Part of that could be, he's probably experiencing some grief, so that could be something like maybe taking some flowers to his mom's grave, or maybe writing a letter to her, to kind of find some closure through that process. Or maybe find a way to continue to honor her memory or celebrate her memory. So there's several different ways that this action side of things, these several sessions focused on action, can play out depending on, again, kind of what the conversation with Joe has been. So I thought that this was a fun take on ACT within elderly population. This focused on just one individual, Joe, but I really like ACT therapy because it focuses on that psychological flexibility instead of this kind of cognitive fusion with our thoughts. And so you can see here how it seems like it was pretty helpful for Joe. And here are the discussion posts for this week, or the discussion post and questions prompts for this week. So you can see here that you have a couple different options. You can choose 1 to 2 of the questions. Again, just remember that your discussion post needs to be a certain word count, and your comment to peers need to be a certain word count. And here are my references. Please let me know if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns. Have a wonderful week.